let me actually start with the back of the room over there, and then we'll work our way forward. Yeah, please. 30 seconds, please.
Just one sentence that I'll make. Purpose of policy prescriptions is also to take into account the reality, the given situation. Now, if political economy is the given situation, I found Shibani Ghosh's prescriptions more, constructive rather than Mr. Shetty's suggestion that political economy creates impossible situations. Then there's a question about, China doing better in terms of regulatory mechanism. Does it have an impact on the political system as such? Is an authoritarian political system is better suited to take such actions rather than democracy? And what effect will it have on Indian democracy as such?
Great, thank you. Maybe you can also just briefly introduce yourself. Mr. Jha, you had your hand up earlier, I think.
Thank you. I will take 30 seconds. First, just a couple of points of information. Mr. Somanathan, stubble can be removed by happy seeders, but there is two stages of straw cutting which precede that. One is when the grain is cut, and the other is when they cut with these balers about everything up except about 12 inches of ground. That straw, you cannot, is also being burned just now. I want to make one suggestion, that you can only deal with this problem if the farmer can find an alternative use for the straw that makes him money. And the only use that I know of is actually to either torrefy it, to sell it in lieu of coal, but a better use of that is to char it and use the char as biochar briquettes as a replacement for what is it called, coking coal. And the third one, of course, is to use these briquettes for conversion to transport fuel via gasification. I suggest that all three be looked at. If you don't give this incentives, and by the way, they will double farm incomes and give you, among other things, I've written a whole article in very great detail with a co-author from Terry, which I invite you to read. But please do look at this. Without incentivizing the farmer, your top-down approach, we must do this, we must do that, we must sensitize, we must make aware.
Thank you. Great, thank you. I think there was you had your hand up, right? Two over from you.
Yeah, I'm Anu Acharya. I just wanted to ask one question. If we assume that pollution will only increase and pollution board has money to spend, why can't they invite like a grand challenge and spend the money on innovations rather than, trying to figure out the other way around? So cutting down rather than find like some solutions that will allow us to increase the amount of pollutants you can take from the air rather than the other way around.
Thank you. And one question right behind you, then we'll come to this side of the room in the second half.
Well, I wish to know whether you all spoke about the air pollution. Can't you incorporate the noise pollution also?
So I think we have our hands full with air at the moment. So it's a fair question, but if you don't mind, we'll defer that to next year's dialogue.
Particularly in the transport sector.
Yeah. But thank you. If anybody wants to comment on that.
And one more thing I wanted to ask about the happy seeders. What is the cost factor involved, please, per acre?
All right. Thank you. Would you like to? Who would like to take these questions? Anybody want to pick up? Please.
I just thought I'll use this opportunity to give some bits of information about the work that the ministry is doing. Responding to Professor Somanathan's very, very genuine criticism that the CPCBs and the state boards are terribly understaffed, the CPCB has about 500 odd people at the moment. So we are planning to increase the staff strength by 200 odd more. So it's almost like a 50% jump over what CPCB's current staff strength is. And 90% of those will be all scientific personnel. So that is something that the ministry has started work upon. On the issue that you raised, sir, regarding the use of stubble in various industries, the Ministry of Power has actually brought out a notification late last year encouraging the power plants to use it in co-firing with coal, and to the extent of up to 10%. It has not been very successful, and only NTPC actually has put out a tender, and they are planning to use it in one of their plants. What the Ministry of Power is currently thinking about is whether they could actually make this compulsory for all the power plants in the Delhi NCR states. So if that is done, then possibly the entire mechanism of getting a suitable price for stubble could actually start working. So I think they have agreed broadly that this needs to be done, but we still have to see an order to that effect. The third issue that, ma'am, you raised about innovations and a grand challenge, there is a very, very generous amount of funding available with the Central Pollution Control Board under the EPC charges that have been imposed by the Supreme Court on 2000 cc plus vehicles. They are getting close to 100 crore rupees every year, and we are using this amount to fund a lot of innovative projects. So if there are any innovative ideas that are there in this room, please feel free to apply to CPCB. We are actually willing to fund projects which may not be a proven technology, and we are even willing to give money to experimental projects. So a lot of experiments are also being tried out. So if there are any good ideas, especially on ideas of how do you reduce pollution from the ambient air. So we still do not have any large-scale working model for that. So if there are some ideas. In fact, a lot of students from Georgia Tech University are actually working on this, and they want to collaborate with CPCB in opposing solutions under the EPC. So there's a huge amount of interest that is currently there on the technology front, and we are trying our very best to encourage this effort. Thank you.
Anybody else want to add to any of the questions? Something you want to talk about the crop? Sorry, you had something to say, please, yeah.
So I think responding to the gentleman who talked about how China does it, it's fascinating research, economic research to show how China actually uses environmental regulations to shut down industries that it wants to shut down for other purposes. Their environmental regulations are actually a choking system of penalization of a certain sector when they want to bring it down. So yes, I don't think these comparisons really come into place. It doesn't make sense to compare ourselves with China. Also, these comparisons of what would work, I think we need to think deeper about what works for the EPA in the US may not work over here, simply in terms of thinking of number of people. It will not work simply because, say, the normal way of administration has been saying how many government employees do you have per 1,000 or a million citizens. Now, clearly with our densities, that logic does not work. It's simply like replicating the logic of saying, oh, on an average, 2 cars per 100 citizens is very good and we should have the same. We've landed up exactly where we are now. So I think the nature of governance for us is going to be very different. It cannot be built on saying we'll replicate an EPA model of inspections. It cannot be built on, say, what China has done. And I think there we have faltered in the last 5-7 years. We've not been able to imagine an institutional framework that responds to our needs. Perhaps the one that responds to Delhi is going to be very different than the one that responds to rest of the places, simply because of nature of density. And this, I remember this question I'd once asked somebody, like, if we had the right of the pedestrian as we have in perhaps Europe and US, when would the cars ever move in Delhi? With the density of pedestrians walking across a road, we cannot replicate the same models. We have to reimagine ourselves, and I think we've not done that so far. We've been adopting too much, or at least promised to adopt a lot from the US. I think we faltered in imagining that space. I think in the previous government, there was a reimagination of the governance system, and it fell apart simply because of these basic things. On somebody prescribing more hope to Shibani than me, I'm actually very glad. My job is not to prescribe hope. My job is to act like a gadfly, hopefully at whatever pace work happens. As watchdogs, our job is to still sound skeptical about it and say it has to be paced more. So the hope should be on people like Shivani who are doing real work rather than me who are just criticizing it.
I'm not even sure whether you actually accidentally made a case for a right for pedestrians. You know, it's like, may not be such a bad idea to bring cars to a grinding halt for a while. Som, did you want to add anything, or should we move to a second round and maybe? Okay. Thank you. So let's start from the front this time. So this gentleman here, and then the lady back there, and then we'll work our way back.
My name is R.P. Lahiri. I am alumnus IIT Kharagpur. I have got my own consulting firm. I hover from Delhi, Calcutta to California and all that. My question is, in your study, what is the next process? Does it go to the right hand, or it's in the good place, it will be kept in a showcase and all that? I think you will do that. Second question is, in the study, I did not see somebody studied the impact of domestic diseases on the environment. I had gone many times to the Delhi Pollution Control Board, and many people, they said it is not in our act for private diseases. It is only commercial diseases. And private diseases, huge pollution. In the study, nobody has mentioned all the sludge and all those things are accumulated in the Delhi roads. I stay in Patparganj area. I see, does it not get pollution? It is being done because they are not paid. Why they are not paid? Now these questions are not studied.
Okay. So
and you have not referred also. Third is,
so we've got lots of questions. So I think we need.
No, I know that you'll be very, because you will not answer this question and it will be hitting you. Why this question is being asked? I saw in US, and if you spit on the road, you have to pay $1,000 fine straight. Nobody would. Here, you do not have any system. They have got exclusive for more than one car, one person and one person. If one person, they have to follow one road.
Right.
And if more than one, there is no system here.
Okay, I think we've got the point. So
anyway, my question is, why your study is so short? There are so many areas that should be looked in, and I do not think that it will have any impact to the policymakers who does it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We'll address as many of those as we can. Yep, back there, lady behind you.
So I have an extension to what Nitin actually was talking about in terms of environmental governance. See, CPCB in India is mainly a regulator, and we have the ministry. Now, we do not have an EPA in India. We do not have an organization which will actually think of an institution and actually create one and keep rethinking it. So because policy in any other country, or I mean, if you're not comparing, anywhere else is generally thought every year again and again. Scientific reviews happen, and there is a cycle to policy. So the policy cycle is not reviewed in India, or it is reviewed in a piecemeal manner through various studies. So would it not be a better idea to actually propose and actually have an EPA or an organization or an institution which would act like one?
Thank you. Yes, over.
My name is Alok Gupta from Invecologic. First of all, congratulations to the panel for such a well-rounded and engaging discussion in such a small duration of time. Lots of thoughts, but quickly, one question and one remark. Question is on understanding the rationale behind 30% pollution reduction target in the next 5 years. How ambitious do you think it is? Should it be much more ambitious against the backdrop of the severity of impacts that we are already facing? The second remark is on a number of studies which have been quoted in the panel and the ones which are not quoted. By and large, a number of surveys have very limited sample size, which I don't think does justice to the huge population that we have. So if we could increase the sample size.
Great. There's a question. Let's take the two questioners back there, and then we'll probably have to close it. Very, very briefly, if you would, please.
My question is addressed to Mr. Singh. I just want to find out what is the government of India planning to do in the next 1 year, say on air pollution. How are you planning to control it? So I mean, excuse me, can you just, can I? So how are you planning to control air pollution? What have you planned? And secondly, what are you putting in the budget, in the next year's budget? And thirdly, how are you going to be working vis-a-vis the states? Thank you.
Okay, my question is to Mr. Ritesh. Can you tell me, sir, how intelligent or foolish was the decision of the government of India increasing the fares of the Delhi Metro, which has brought down the ridership, and which has even made it, the Ola share and the Uber share cheaper than the metro fares? And second is, same question to you, sir. There is recently a city made all its public transport free. Can you tell me the name of the city which made the public transport free recently? Entire public transport free.
Okay. Yeah, I think you need a little time to reflect on this. We can have a few other questions. Well,
Mr. Ritesh, you are the public servant, and I believe the way you public servants are selected are some journal knowledge. You need. You need to
okay, let's give him a chance
put your
to
place
respond,
which
please.
you are. I hope you really. You need to prove that you deserve to sit there, and have my taxpayer's salary,
Thanks for the question. Let's have a chance to respond. Actually, let me start by asking Shibani maybe to talk about some of the questions around the EPA and the environmental regulatory governance system.
So, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there have been proposals to come up with an independent regulator. In fact, I think it was kind of mentioned in 2009, 2010, the previous government had tried to bring it. But those didn't go anywhere. I think there is a need for independence in regulation, and there's a need for scrutiny and kind of rethinking. But I'm not entirely convinced that the new institution at this point is going to resolve the problem. But certainly improving the quality and working of existing institutions will. I mean, I'm just thinking there are steps, for instance, in the environmental clearance process where we do have scope for independent scrutiny, such as the Expert Appraisal Committee. But those processes are not being explored in their entirety. In fact, those processes are being curtailed right now to remove the independence that those bodies have. So I do agree that there's need for more independence and scrutiny and rethinking our policy processes. But I'm not sure whether we can wait for new regulators to be set up. Our experience with institutions like the National Green Tribunal has been quite bad in terms of how much support they will get from the government in setting up. So that's kind of in short my answer on to a new independent regulator.
So did you want to add on that point that you've written about this recently?
Yeah. So I have written about this, as I mentioned, in this environment brief, which is available on our website and at the University of Chicago Center website. But basically, my proposal is that yes, we do need an independent regulator, and the reasoning behind that is basically that environmental problems are very technically complex, right? They're difficult scientific problems. It's very hard for the political process to engage with these problems. So you cannot solve these problems through the electoral process one by one. It's not that today we'll all get worried about air pollution, we'll make a big noise about it, then, in the next election, the government will make that an election issue, and then they'll do something. Then tomorrow it's going to be water pollution, and the day after that it's going to be pesticides, right? It doesn't work that way. It's too complicated. The political process is very short term, right? At a maximum, you have a 5-year term, right? Any elected government, right? But 5 years is not enough for a problem like this, number one. Number two, in practice, it's much less than a 5-year term because you keep facing all kinds of elections in the meantime, plus there are many other things on your plate, right? So the political process is not well geared to solving these problems. That's why I think that you really need delegation to an independent regulator who has a much longer time frame, right? Number one. Number two, I think that this is not going to go anywhere in our current political system because once you have an independent regulator with real teeth, right? I'm assuming in my proposal the regulators automatically funded by a percentage charge on industry, so they have a large budget. Secondly, they're completely autonomous, so they don't have to take permission from government to hire anybody, what to pay them and so on. You need that. If you don't have that, you have the situation now. The CPCB and other boards are giving money back to the government because they can't spend it. Why can't they spend it? Because they're too, they just don't have the freedom to act. They don't have the freedom to hire people. They don't have the freedom to take decisions, right? So when you're bound by rules and regulations to that degree, you cannot be effective. So yes, you need that autonomy.
And thirdly, I think the only way this is going to work in our political system is that that regulator should be charged with setting pollution fees. Pollution fees that actually raise revenue, and then that money goes to the government. And then the government, which is an elected government, right, with democratic legitimacy, that government decides, okay, who needs to be compensated? Okay, you have a congestion fee in order to reduce the traffic congestion. Do the auto drivers, should they be compensated? Is it the two-wheeler drivers? Is it the people who own private cars? Is it the transporters? You know, how should that revenue be used? Should it be used to build more pavements? Should it be used to build bicycle paths? Whatever. But that's a political decision, and that should be taken by the political authority. But what we need to do is we need to separate the technical scientific decisions from the political decisions. I think that's the step that we do need to take.
Sorry, we really won't have time. We'll maybe take it up afterwards. Maybe let's make this also any concluding remarks that you want to make. We'll just sort of go around the panel.
I'll just try to address a couple of questions that were raised. The 30% pollution reduction targets that was mentioned. I would tend to agree that I think it's a very modest target that we have. If you look at what has been achieved in Delhi over the last couple of years, we are seeing a 10% reduction in PM 2.5 from 2016 to 17 and from 2017 to 18. So it's roughly at about 20% reduction from 2016 to 2018. So in Delhi, if we are able to keep up the momentum and we are able to, say, bring it down by 50% over 5 years, then why not in other places? I think my sense is that in Delhi, there's a huge amount of focus in Delhi. Please believe me when I say this, there's a huge amount of focus in Delhi. It's probably not there in the other parts of the country. So nobody if you pick up the newspapers from Kanpur, for example, which is the most polluted city as per the WHO list, you won't find any mention of the air pollution levels in Kanpur on a daily basis, whereas it is there in every newspaper, including the Hindi newspapers in Delhi. So I think we can actually do better in the other cities as well. So probably going along, we will possibly review the targets that we have set for the other cities as well and see if we can possibly do better than what we have set out to do. You, ma'am, asked about, I think, that what's the plan for next year. I think the two important things which we tried our best, but we were not very, very successful in this year. One, of course, was stubble burning. I think the big challenge there was that we were not, and I'm very happy to say, in fact, I was asking Professor Somnathan if I could lay my hands on his presentation and share that with the Ministry of Agriculture so that they can also use the learnings that have been identified. I think the biggest problem in the stubble burning issue was that the implements actually reached pretty late. In spite of all our efforts of completing the procurement process, transferring the money to the state government, making sure that all the beneficiaries are identified, then the DBT, etc. Everything was there, but I think the implements actually reached the farms in Punjab maybe just a week before the harvesting. In Haryana, maybe 2 to 3 weeks before harvest. So I think we need to make sure that the government gets its entire implementation machinery absolutely spot on in 2019 to make sure that the implements are there well in time. The IEC program, I was told, was done pretty well, and I think Professor Somnathan's study actually bears that out, that the IEC has actually been done pretty well, and that is why the awareness amongst farmers also is pretty high. The other thing I think on which, again, we have slipped is the issue of firecrackers. Firecrackers, in spite of a clear Supreme Court order saying that in the Delhi NCR region, firecrackers will not be sold, I think we were not very good in enforcing that ban. And if you look at the PM 2.5 numbers post-Diwali, it was really horrendous. So I think these are the two things for which we already have the regulatory systems in place, and we need to make sure that we get it absolutely spot on next year. These are the two important steps I think we need to really focus on in the coming year. And of course, all the other things, the road sweeping machines, the water sprinkling, etc., the enforcement, the inspections, etc., those will go on, and the pressure has to be kept on the Delhi government and the satellite cities of Delhi.
One quick thing off the topic of the conversation. I think all of us should be more encouraging of officers like Mr. Singh who are coming forth and discussing things. It's not about the personal individual. These are nature of institutions. It's not about him. And I'm glad the candidness with which he's discussing and sharing where they are going right and wrong. On the new framework for what might agree, I completely agree with Shibani, and I think I'll try and put words in her mouth of why she's saying we should not change the laws at this moment. I personally believe the reason she's saying this is because there's a good fear, and I think there's a legitimate fear that if you open up the existing laws, you'll actually see greater dilution and you'll see upward mobility in this process. And there is clear evidence to, at least in my mind, why we have this fear. In the last 4 years, we've seen systematic dilution of the existing regulatory framework. We do not see any hope of this changing overnight because the political economy is not changed. But leave the last 4 or 5 years or the last 10 years aside, I think there's a larger trend that's happening in governance, and that raises a question for us on the environmental forum also. We've seen, one, a degree of tribunalization happen of justice in different areas. We've seen also tribunalization and externalization of regulatory frameworks, saying that we are taking it outside the political framework and we are handing it over to experts who will act independently. And the initial idea always was that the independent experts will be independent, then we realized they're not, but actually we've lost track of how they are being controlled. The constitutional framework and the laws do not provide us access to how the linkages are drawn between these external institutions and political frameworks. So there's a threat, I think, that we should not replicate in the governance system we have here. I think this attempt to short circuit and say because democracy, electoral politics does not work, therefore we shall have external experts, clearly is a thing fraught with a lot of dangers. And I can provide proof to this. We provided economic costs to cutting down forests in what was called the Campa funds. You can say that we'll have an economic cost imposed on pollution and that'll be collected and spent on the right thing. The fact is the amount that would be charged per activity would also be a political process, and it would be scaled down to a point that is useless. Clearly, we've seen this also. Now, a larger question, I'll end with this saying, we've had, I don't know if we're right or wrong, and we must think about it, all of us, that we've had a process of saying where we've separated justice from delivery of services. The moment you start turning delivery of justice into an economic cost factor, the nature of governance you have completely changes. When we imagine that pollution which causes public health damage can be repaired by charging a certain price, compensating the other, it's a mechanism that is socially not being done by us so far. If we are going to move in that direction, we must think about it deeper when we do this. So far in our political economy, this process has constantly failed, both that we paid a price of not being able to deliver justice even to the point we were, and not being able to collect enough resources out of this process to do better.
Thanks. Actually, I think this works. Nitin's actually articulated a lot of things that I wanted to say very well, so I don't want to repeat any of them, but I would only repeat one because I think it's really important. We do have existing systems and infrastructure that we need to use much better. So I think to create another institutional framework at this point really goes down this road of being extremely worried that it would dilute what we have, which is enough for us to work with at the moment for our needs. Of course, there's always scope for improvement, but the current system doesn't necessarily give us optimism to think that we can improve that at the moment. The concern is that we will dilute. The only other thing that I would like to add is that I think the Delhi NCR bears a greater responsibility in some senses, because all of the governance systems, the Supreme Court, all the governance systems that you need to work are sitting here. And if we can't get the Delhi NCR to make the right actions, then, and with the kind of political salience the issue has, so I would say from a civil society sort of perspective, I would say that mobilizing in Delhi NCR for solutions becomes a priority going forward, because if we learn and if we can do something here, while it's not one solution fits all, there's a lot that can be learned, hopefully. I also feel that, and I've not heard much discussion on it, but one hopes that the thermal plant emission standards also actually do get implemented. And there's also, I think unfairly the pressures put on the Environment Ministry, but actually we should be looking at some of the other much more powerful ministries in terms of what actions they are or they are not taking on the issue of air quality. So, I mean, it's sort of unfair to expect the Environment Ministry to enforce everything, even though it's their responsibility, while the Power Ministry is trying to actually dilute those very laws. So I think we also need to map and understand the governance structure, which is quite complex, and understand where we need to put pressure better.
Great. Thank you very much, Vinuta. We are a little bit over time, but if you'll indulge me for just 3 or 4 minutes, maybe I just take the prerogative of a couple of concluding remarks. I think we've had a really, really rich conversation. Not everybody has agreed, which is always a good sign, because, you know, I'd be suspicious if everybody was on the same page. You should be suspicious if everybody is on the same page. But just a few concluding observations. One of the things that strikes me is one way of thinking about our approach to environmental regulation is that it's very sort of administratively dominated. There's an assumption that a lot of these problems are amenable to an administrative solution, and in many cases they're not. I think we've had some discussion, for example, about crop burning, and the response there is sort of an administratively decided technical intervention. But we all know that the crop burning situation is much more complicated than that. It's tied to issues around water protection measures. It's tied to subsidies for rice wheat cropping systems. It's tied to our historical use of groundwater. Maybe we need to step back, and of course it's tied to the importance of farmers in the electoral politics of Punjab and Haryana. So maybe we need to step back and put all of those things on the table in order to have a more sort of systemic and sustained conversation about crop burning. And I wonder whether just getting the happy seeders a little bit earlier is going to solve the problem next year. I'd be happy if that were the case, but I wonder if in fact that is so. I think in part we also struggle because all of these issues are politically complex. We talked about industries, shutting down industries so taking strong measures on industrial pollution, and many industries in the NCR are also illegal industries. We've not been able to shut them down because they're legal. Why do we think we'll be able to deal with them just because of the air pollution issue? And this is where perhaps I think this question of thinking about a new administrative structure is a little fraught. So the idea of an independent regulator, my own sort of looking at independent regulators is in the context of the power sector, where the history suggests that just deeming political decisions and technical decisions to be separate doesn't make them so. They're invariably intertwined. And, I've been privy recently to conversations within EPCA, which is quite a powerful body in this city. And without giving away any confidences, I think it's clear to say that within those kinds of bodies that are meant to be taking technically based decisions, you can't be ignorant of the fact that there are political costs of a decision you take. Those things are not so neatly separable. So I'm not sure that we have any silver bullets here. I'm a little worried that we now realize that huge amounts of focus are being placed on Delhi, because actually the curves are going in the wrong direction for Delhi. So what does that say about the rest of India? It seems to me that we need to maybe be stepping back and start from a presumption that this doesn't require marginal changes, small fine-tuning. I think this requires a much more substantial rethink of our approach to environmental regulation, and we've touched on some of the ways in which we could do that in this session, but I would be happy if the session led to a deeper conversation about that. Probably the way forward is through the creative use of the spaces we have. We haven't fully plumbed the extent of our existing laws. We haven't been able to fully unlock the potential of our CPCB and the state pollution control boards, even with the limited capacity, because they're hemmed in all kinds of ways. They're hemmed in because they don't get the support they need politically for enforcement. They don't get the backing of data and technical information, so that they don't actually have to go on site and measure every single polluter. So there's lots of things we could do within the existing structure. One of the things that we at CPR have been playing with is the idea that we need to think about pollution on a source-by-source basis. So the crop problem is very different from the industry problem, which is very different from the transport problem, which is very different from the waste burning problem. In the case of waste, for example, you need to involve civil society much more, RWAs much more. In the case of power plants, it is stroke of the pen solution. We need to be sort of thinking about the politics and the administrative and the technical nature of each of these sources separately. And that's perhaps an idea that we at CPR would very much like to seed and have conversations with all of you about. Let me end with an advertisement, which I think is okay because after all we've talked about the importance of public engagement. Over the last year we held a series of seminars at CPR under the title Clearing the Air. The videos of those were very instructive, very entertaining in some cases. We had a wonderful discussion around crop burning. I invite you to check out the website. And later on this week, we'll have a series coming out in the Hindustan Times based loosely around the arguments Shibani put forward. And we'd welcome your conversation and your comments on that as well. So let me thank all the panelists. Mr. Ritesh, thank you so much for taking time out. I echo what Nitin said. I think it's wonderful that you were able to spend time here and be candid with us. Nitin, it's always instructive to hear you. Vinuta, thanks for all your work over the years as well as your comments here. And Som and Shibani, my co-panelists, thank you all very much for listening patiently.